Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Simply Services session. The Simply Services Speaker Series is an informal platform we created a couple of years ago to share the latest trends in services trade. Today's topic is the decarbonization of transport services, which is at the top of the agenda of the transport sector and may have transformative impact on transport services. From the trade perspective, the decarbonization would impact the structure and the dynamics of transport services market, trade costs and trade scale, investment, as well as transport networks and connectivity. In this context, we are very grateful that today we have experts from maritime, road, and air transport to share the industry's insights on decarbonization, which we believe can bring more clarity to these very complex issues, as well as its trade impact. Before I turn to the speakers, may I invite DDG Annabelle Gonzalez to make the opening remarks. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and hello to everyone, in particular to our speakers here, Simon, Jens, and Jan. Thank you very much for joining us, and our internal speakers as well. Welcome to this Simply Services session. The aim of this session today is to discuss decarbonization from the perspective of trade in transport services. Trade and transport are closely interlinked in the world economy. As we know, transport services not only enable the physically delivered of traded goods and sustain global supply chains, but also contribute to trade in their own right. As we are transitioning to the green economy, sustainable transport services are fundamental to sustainable trade. Further, sustainable trade can help countries adapt and mitigate climate change with lower emissions goods and services and facilitate the use of climate-friendly technologies. So this is a timely seminar. Decarbonization, as we know, is not a buzzword. It is a policy of utmost importance, which is being seriously implemented at all levels, as reducing carbon emissions to address climate change is not a choice, but a necessity. Now, decarbonizing transport services is particularly crucial in our fight against climate change, as it directly addresses the root causes of climate change, the burning of fossil fuels. The majority of vehicles on our roads, ships on our seas, and planes in our skies still rely heavily on fossil fuels. So by transitioning to low carbon and zero emissions alternatives such as electric vehicles, hydrogen powered transportation, or sustainable biofuels, we can significantly reduce carbon emissions from the transport sector. Given the critical importance of transport services in the economy, greening the transport sector will also have far-reaching economic and social implications. The decarbonization of transport services has potential to create economic benefits. For example, investing in low-carbon transport technologies, infrastructure, and clean energy sources can spur innovation, create new industries, and generate employment opportunities. Strong evidence has shown that reducing carbon emissions in the transport sector can directly improve air quality and public health. However, we should recognize that decarbonizing transport services is not an easy task. In fact, the manifold complexity and challenges surrounding the decarbonization of transport services makes it a formidable task. For example, one complexity lies in the diversity of transport modes and their unique characteristics, which entail distinct challenges. From cars and trucks to ships and planes, each mode involves different tasks when it comes to decarbonization. The transition to electric vehicles is promising, but it requires substantial infrastructure investments for charging stations and the development of advanced battery technology. Similarly, decarbonizing maritime and air transport poses considerable challenges due to the long distances covered, limited alternative fuels, and the need for international collaboration to implement changes effectively. Another complexity comes with economic considerations concerning multiple stakeholders. the transition to low carbon transport services may involve significant upfront costs, especially for developing countries or industries heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Balancing the need for environmental sustainability with economic growth, job creation, and trade is always a delicate task. In addition, different stakeholders have different short-term and long-term economic interests, which require sensible policies to balance. For instance, decarbonization solutions focusing on vehicles, ships, and aircraft need to take into consideration their impacts on road, seaport, and airport infrastructure, and vice versa. The global and regional nature of trade in transport services adds another layer of complexity to decarbonization. Supply chain deployment, trade imbalances, divergent national regulations, and differing levels of economic development among countries, all this should be factored in the design of decarbonization initiatives in order to make them more effective. In particular, it has been under discussion how to ensure that the burden and benefits of transitioning to low-carbon transport services are distributed equitably among countries. Trade and trade policy can play an important role in the challenging decarbonization endeavor. Given the complexity of these issues involved and the challenges ahead, policymakers need to communicate with businesses and other stakeholders in order to make informed decisions. Hence, in this Simply Services session, we invited experts from the transport industry to share their insights on how decarbonization would transform trade in transport services, what challenges lie ahead for both the industry and policymakers, and what kind of policies, including trade policy, can help address those challenges. Thank you very much again for being here. Thanks to you, all of you here in the room and all of you who are online as well. And I wish you a very informative and enlightening discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, DDG Gonzalez. Now, I'd like to turn to our speakers. Today, we have three speakers. Mr. Simon Bennett, Deputy Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping. Mr. James Hugo, Senior Advisor, Global Advocacy, International Road Transport Union. And Ms. Mary Owens Thompson online. Senior Vice President and Chief Economist, IATA Sustainability and Economics, International Air Transport Association. We also have two discussants, Mr. Jan Hoffman, Head of Trade Logistic Branch, I think it's a Division of Transport and Logistics, UNCTAD, and my colleague, Ms. Antonia Gazzaniga, Counselor of Trading Services and Investment Division of WTO. We have asked each speaker to address the following questions. What are the initiatives taken or in the pipeline to implement decarbonization in your industry? How would they contribute to decarbonization goals set at the national and international levels? How would you assess the impact of decarbonization on your industry and the related trade? And what are the challenges posed by decarbonization for your industry? Which challenge is the toughest in your view? And which policies may help the transport industry cope with the challenges? Without further ado, I'd like to first give the floor to Simon to talk about the decarbonization of shipping. The floor is yours, Simon.
There we go. Thank you. That's quite a tough assignment you gave us to sum up everything that's going on in our industries in just a few minutes. But thank you very much for this invitation. So, of course, I am from the international shipping industry, and ICS, we are the global trade association for the shipping industry, and our membership comprises the world's national ship owner associations. So that's 80% of the global fleet. And we represent the industry with the international regulatory institutions, in particular, our shipping regulator, the International Maritime Organization. So to begin with then, so shipping is responsible for about 90% of global trade by volume, which means we are responsible for about 3% of total greenhouse gas emissions. This very large container ship, the largest container ships carry up to 24,000 boxes. And these large ships, their typical annual fuel cost will be something like $30 million, to give you an idea of the scale. We are a very hard to abate sector because, of course, we're completely dependent on fossil fuels. We do have a good story to tell. In the last 15 years, the shipping industry globally has reduced its carbon intensity by between 30 and 35%. That's measured in ton miles, which is a ton of cargo moved 1 nautical mile. Our emissions are still below what they were in 2008, and that's despite a 50% increase in maritime trade during that period. But the pressure is now really on to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So we're regulated by the UN International Maritime Organization, which has been given responsibility for shipping's emissions by UNFCCC. With the mandatory global efficiency standards that we have to comply with, the sector is now on track to achieve a 40% reduction of carbon intensity by 2030. But only so much can be achieved with these efficiency measures so long as ships are using fossil fuels and if trade continues to grow. And net zero emissions by the middle of the century can only be achieved with the uptake of low and zero GHG fuels. We're actually in the middle of a very intensive round of negotiations at the IMO, and in July, the IMO member states will revise their grand greenhouse gas strategy. This is really the Paris Agreement for shipping. And we do expect IMO to formally adopt a net zero target for 2050, or depending on the nuances, a mid-century goal. And we expect IMO to prioritise 2 sets of midterm measures, regulatory measures for further development. Firstly, a kind of command and control global fuel standard to reduce the GHG intensity of marine fuels, ultimately by 100% by 2050, a technical measure. And then also they are looking at an economic measure, in other words, a levy per tonne of emissions that will be paid to an IMO fund in order to accelerate the transition to zero. And that includes a proposal put forward by the shipping industry, which we call a fund and reward measure, which I'll talk to in a moment. So the industry's position is that the phase out of emissions by the middle of the century, that's going to require the rapid acceleration of the uptake of alternative fuels. And the scale of this challenge really cannot be overestimated because, frankly, the current use of these low and zero carbon fuels is virtually zero. So the industry supports a global economic measure to narrow the significant cost gap with conventional fuels and to incentivize first movers with rewards for the emissions prevented by the use of eligible alternative fuels. To be blunt, there's only 2 ways to get to zero. Either you have the rapid and widespread global uptake of these new fuels, and this has to begin by 2030, or we're going to be confronted with the rationing of maritime transport with obvious significant impacts for the economy and prosperity. And that's why we need an economic measure urgently to de-risk transition by reducing this cost gap for first movers as soon as possible. And the energy producers, the fuel suppliers to shipping, need a clear signal about demand for these new fuels. So to get to net zero by the middle of the century, we need to reach a takeoff point by 2030. And that's why the industry has also proposed a new target of at least 5% of the energy used by shipping in 2030 to be generated from alternative fuels. So we've come forward with a fund and reward measure in order to incentivize the production and uptake of alternative fuels to achieve this 2030 takeoff point. But at the same time, we want to generate billions of dollars of funds annually to support the maritime GHG reduction efforts of developing countries. The industry does support a global fuel standard, but a fuel standard alone won't get us where we need to be by 2030. We need an economic measure too, because without an economic measure, when the carbon intensity of fuels permitted by a fuel standard, when that's rapidly reduced in the 2030s, there's going to be no guarantee that there's going to be the necessary quantities of new fuels available, especially given the competition we face from other industrial sectors, including the other transport sectors on this panel. So this is why we've come forward with our fund and reward measure, because the investments required over the next few years are going to involve hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And time is running out, and we need, if we're going to kickstart a transition, we need to de-risk investment in new fuels by first movers and send a clear signal to the energy producers. So we want to narrow the cost gap with the conventional fuels to incentivize the uptake of new fuels to get to this takeoff point. And we want to support the efforts of developing countries. But importantly, I'm getting onto some economics now. Importantly, we've designed the measure so that the contribution rate by ships to an IMO fund will be set with a levy quantum that's sufficient to achieve these purposes, but at the same time avoiding any negative, really disproportionately negative impacts on the economies of states. And actually, we believe a flat rate contribution that could actually be less than $40 a ton of fuel could be sufficient for the purpose. So ships, with what's been proposed is that ships would pay a flat rate levy to an IMO fund. This would have the purpose of funding a rewards program for first movers, but there would also be a separate maritime sustainability board to support GHG reduction projects, massive projects in developing countries. And then ships using eligible alternative fuels would receive rewards for the emissions prevented by the use of alternative fuels compared to using conventional diesel gas oil. And this is equivalent to saving about 50 million tons of CO2 a year. But far more important is that in the long term, this mechanism will allow us to achieve the accelerated reductions that are going to be necessary in the 2030s if we're going to get to net zero. And we've proposed that an IMO sustainability board would determine the priorities for programs in developing countries, with billions of dollars a year being provided to support the production of alternative fuels in ports and bunkering infrastructure. In simple terms, we propose that about 2/3 of the money collected each year should be used for a rewards program, with the remainder being used to help developing countries, with a small bit for research and development. But these percentages would be reviewed in 2030. And our measure is designed to be neutral about which fuels and technologies would be rewarded. But we would expect rewards to be given for the use of methanol, hydrogen, ammonia, sustainable biofuels, synthetic fuels, and also increasing interest now in carbon capture technology. Now, the key issue for governments is avoiding these disproportionately negative impacts on their economies of increasing maritime fuel costs by adding a mandatory contribution from shipping. Now, in the shipping industry, we support a flat rate contribution because that's a system that all sectors can live with. And I should mention, actually, as an industry, we are opposed to emissions trading due to the variable and volatile costs of allowances. And actually, most shipping companies are SMEs, surprisingly. The average shipping company only operates about 5 ships. But this view actually is now shared by most IMO member states, including at the global level, interestingly, the EU, given that they're about to implement a regional emissions trading system. Now, we've, as part of the negotiations, we prepared a very detailed impact assessment with Clarkson's Research, who are a major maritime shipbroking firm. And we analysed the impact of a levy on freight rates and the price of delivered cargo for a range of different quanta, looking at many different trades and voyages. So, for example, we looked at what the very price-sensitive iron ore trades between Australia and China and Brazil and China, crude oil, oil products, and perishable agricultural products between South America and Asia. And then we compared these with bunker prices and volatility of freight rates over the previous 10-year period. And if you're interested in this report, you can find it via the ICS website, and the number is the IMO document number is on the slide. I haven't got time to run through all this, but there's lots of pretty pictures and very useful information about prices and freight rate volatility. But the main conclusion was that if you have a levy of less than $150 a ton of fuel, that probably wouldn't have any disproportionately negative impacts on the economies of states. And that includes developing countries, it includes geographically remote markets, when seen in the context of freight rate volatility over the last 10 years. And that also has to be seen in the context of we're suggesting that actually a levy contribution equivalent to less than $40 a ton of fuel, which will still raise about $10 billion a year, would probably be sufficient for what we're trying to achieve. But this will all require a comprehensive impact assessment that we expect to be conducted by a body like UNCTAD. And I'm coming to a close, but what we're trying to do is that the objective is to achieve a balance between having sufficient contributions from a levy to achieve our decarbonisation purposes, narrow the cost gap, kickstart the transition, at the same time avoiding disproportionately negative economic impacts on states. In other words, we're trying to come up with a solution that will be politically acceptable. So what's not to like? The happy news is that the shipping industry is willing to make a contribution to an IMO fund. We don't think there'd be any really serious impacts on states, and billions of dollars of guaranteed funding would be provided for developing countries to support a global transition. But also, most importantly, is that there would be very significant incentives for first movers to reduce this cost gap and kickstart the production and the uptake of the fuels that we need, so that an ambitious net zero target can remain plausible. Otherwise, it's just going to be an unrealistic political aspiration. These issues are complex, but we hope that in our proposals, we've identified the variables that can allow governments to have a clearer understanding of the trade impacts of a levy system, so that the IMO can move forward quickly with finalising an economic fund and reward measure by 2025. Because if shipping is to reach net zero, we have to achieve this takeoff point by 2030 with a concrete measure that will narrow the price gap and send this clear signal we need for energy producers. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this highly informative presentation. I think it highlights the tremendous challenges facing the decarbonization of shipping, but also I think you also raise our hope. I think we will have time for comments and Q&A after all the presentations. I think now I'd like to turn to Jens to present the decarbonization of road transport. Jens, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While I do my words of introduction, maybe you can show the slides. First of all, I would like to congratulate the WTO for putting the Trade Environment Week together, which I believe is a really important meeting. And especially this event today puts together a nice link between trade, transport, and our decarbonization work. So congratulations for this very important milestone and work. For those of you who don't know the IRU, a few words about the IRU. And please change the slides for me. Thank you. The IRU is the voice of 3.5 million transport companies, and we are represented in more than 100 countries. You might know the IRU for the TIER system, the UN TIER Convention, because we're the implementing partner of this longest standing public-private partnership in the UN history. And as a matter of fact, we're celebrating this year our 75th anniversary. And we do celebrate the success story of the UN TIER Convention together with all our partners. Now, I think we should get some of the basics right. Despite the COVID pandemic and despite the war in Ukraine, our view is that globalization is here to stay. And if you just look around you, everything that you see was at one point on a truck. The computer that you're typing on at the moment, the suit, the shirt, everything was on a truck at one point in its life. And the challenge is really to make sure how this transport, this essential transport, complies with sustainable development ideas and how is it decarbonized in the best way. And I think one point is also important to understand. We don't transport about over thousands of kilometers. We leave it to the maritime sector to do that for us. What we transport is the first and last mile. More than 68% of all transport is below 150 kilometers. So it's more from one city to another. That's what we do. So I think it's important to get this basis right. At the same time, and as all the other modes, we need to work on our decarbonization, on our CO2 footprint. And every mode has a role to play. Maritime, air, everybody has a role to play. And within our sector, we are committed to fully decarbonize our industry by 2050. And we have there a so-called Green Compact, which is a roadmap and a commitment that outlines the way on how to decarbonize it. It's based on 5 pillars: alternative fuels, efficient logistics, collective mobility, efficient vehicles, and driver training. Now, Simon said just before, for the maritime sector, there are 2 choices. Either you change fuel or you stop shipping. If I got it right, that was in a nutshell the message. I think we can be a little bit more precise in the way we say that. I think there's no silver bullet. There are various solutions on how to decarbonize the transport sector. This way has to be pragmatic and it has to be realistic. And there's not one silver bullet that works for all the countries, for all the regions. If you talk in Europe about alternative fuels, battery electric vehicles, fine. Go to Southeast Asia, go to India or to Pakistan and tell somebody, well, actually from tomorrow you got to drive a zero emission electric truck. You will say like, oh, first of all, I can't afford that. Secondly, I don't know where to refuel it. And thirdly, I mean, how can I use it in the first place? I mean, it's a ridiculous solution for these countries. So what works in Europe might not work in other countries. And I think it's really important, if you look at the trade part of it, not to build fortresses, to say like, you can only trade in Europe if you have a battery electric vehicle or a zero electric vehicle. It does not work. You have to be pragmatic and very realistic in your approach. And I would like to talk you through some of the low-hanging fruits that we feel are practical solutions. One of them is eco trucks, longer and heavier vehicles. In a nutshell, they have standard vehicle combinations that are just put together with 2 articulated trucks. And you can reduce the carbon footprint by 30% by using them. And the key is that you allow them to use and to operate across borders. That is something that's missing at the moment. Countries are like, well, maybe you can do it on those routes, but you cannot go cross-border. But if you want to have real trade, allow these pragmatic solutions to go across border. Let us to do this trade. We know how to best decarbonize in a quick and scalable way. A second very pragmatic solution is driver training. In some regions like Europe, with driver training, you can reduce the fuel consumption maybe by 2%. It's minuscule. If you go to Southeast Asia, a trained driver reduces his fuel consumption by 15%, thus less CO2 emissions. And you could say, like, well, it costs money for the transport operators to do the driver training, but for him it means he needs to pay less for the fuel, less vehicle downtime, less accidents, less CO2 emissions, and ultimately these guys think with their pocket. If you tell them, you train your driver, you save fuel, you save the CO2, the world by doing this, he will follow you. He will follow you, but that's pragmatic. It's realistic. If you tell them from now on, you need to use battery electric vehicles, he will say, I'm not going to do that. I'm simply not going to do that. One of the concerns that we have is when it comes to trade and efficient logistics, when trucks arrive at borders, they're stuck. They're stuck sometimes for weeks, sometimes even for months, wasting fuel, wasting productivity, and the drivers are almost like taken hostage because they're just inching ahead centimeter for centimeter to reach the border to cross it. The reason for this is inadequate and inappropriate border crossing procedures. But there are solutions, simple solutions to change that. And one of the solutions is the UNTIR Convention. It's a customs convention that facilitates cross-border transport by road. And I've added here the WTO TFA agreement because TIR fulfills almost 80% of the WTO TFA. Article 11, 1, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, covered by the TIR system. And it's not financing that we're looking for. It's not financing. We're looking for an enabling environment that helps us to do trade, transport, and at the same time reduce our footprint. That is really how you get us, and that is really how we can scale up environmental performance quickly. We don't want to wait for years to have alternative fuels in India, in Pakistan, in Southeast Asia. Allow us now to scale up practical solutions, realistic solutions to decarbonize our sector quickly. And what we want to see is this: free-flowing traffic, green transport. That's what we want. We don't want to see this. We don't want to see trucks idling, wasting fuel. We don't want trade. We want green transport. We want it now. Help us to scale this up as quick as possible. You can also join us on a political initiative highlighting the importance of transport, highlighting the importance of the decarbonization efforts of our industry. But ultimately, it's all about coordination. It's all about cooperation. And again, I would like to thank the WTO for their great efforts that they do in bringing our industry together with the other stakeholders and combining the views on trade, transport, and decarbonization in one go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. And I think your presentation is also highly interesting. And also, I like the terms you used in your presentation, pragmatic and realistic. And I think your presentation shows us a different perspective about how to approach decarbonization compared to shipping. I think that's really interesting. Now I'd like to invite our last but not least speaker, Mary Owens, to talk about decarbonization of air transport. If the entire transport sector is hard to abate sector, air transport probably is the hardest to abate. Mary Owens, now you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. So there were definitely some cool pictures there from Jens, which I think reminds us all of certain scenes at airports and shipping ports as well recently. So we definitely share that issue across all transportation modes, I'm sure. But anyway, I just wanted to start with the simple fact that all economic development in throughout our human history has been joined at the hip with the history of transportation. So every leap that we have managed to make in terms of improving our economic and social outcomes has been intimately connected with, of course, corresponding improvements in how we move around, or connectivity, generally speaking. do we have our slides? We just had our annual general meeting, and if I can have the previous slide, please. We had this annual general meeting in Turkey, so I like to show this little quote from Rumi, as we know him in the West, yeah, where he said in the 1200s that travel brings power and love back into your life. So that was the conviction in the 1200s. And then fast forward to the next slide, we had a group of very inspired individuals during the Second World War who created civil aviation, actually, with the Chicago Convention, and collectively realized the power of civil aviation in terms of promoting peace and understanding. And we know that these attributes are, of course, the same for trade, yeah, because this is the transportation history and the leaps forward in economic outcomes is obviously intimately linked with all the trade, not only in goods and services, but also in ideas and culture and so on, that has brought us to this advanced civilization which we now enjoy. So all the 193 UN member countries have signed on to the Chicago Convention by now. And on the next page, we of course have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe we flip. Yep, thank you. and this is sort of the most high-level agenda that we have in terms of, you know, economic priorities in the universe today. And I think that if we accept what I said earlier, that transportation connectivity is an essential driver of economic development, then obviously we all understand that we have a fundamental impact on this action agenda that the world has set itself. And you know, maybe I think that putting climate action as number 13 is a little bit bizarre, because it's obviously a wholly systemic crisis and touches every lever in this picture. But the point here is that you know, I think that we have all agreed that we need to fly. We also need to drive, and we need shipping. But you know, I'm obviously from IATA, so I will say that the world has agreed that we need to fly if we want to address all of these issues. And on the next page, we just want to show that IATA, the organization I represent, which has about 300 airlines as members, and we cover maybe 83% of global air traffic, committed in 2021 to becoming net zero in 2050, and ICAO, our UN body for civil aviation, did the same in 2022. So for us, there's no doubt we must fly, and we must fly sustainably. So when we then turn to how this looks in terms of our emissions, this is sort of the scenario. The blue bar is the emissions that we think that we might emit in 2050. And the little black bar in the blue bar is the uncertainty range. So maybe we will emit more, maybe we will emit somewhat less. And with our own efficiency improvements, we think that we can reduce those total emissions by the amount of the yellow little block there and its uncertainty range. And if we add hydrogen to the mix, we can reduce them further, our own operations a little bit further. And then we can all see that the big contributor to bringing about sustainable aviation is indeed sustainable aviation fuel. And there will still be a certain amount of emissions that we cannot neutralize simply by, not simply, but by the sum of those. We will also absolutely need carbon removals to get to net zero. So this is what we are trying to do. And on the next page, we can see what the world looks like today. So this is sort of how much sustainable aviation fuel that has been produced compared to, you know, our consumption of jet fuel, and we can see that in 2022 there was 0.1% of our total fuel demand produced in sustainable aviation fuel. So this, I think, is a really, really important point to make, that people need to realize, as was indeed alluded to earlier, that this market is completely inexistent and needs to be created. So So today, the sustainable aviation fuel that is being produced, whatever little there is produced using this HEFA pathway, which is waste fats mostly. And there are a number of other pathways to produce a sustainable aviation fuel that have been produced, but they're not yet, they're sort of laboratory approved. Yeah, they have been approved, but they are not yet commercialized. But airlines, as you can see on the right, are starting to make offtake agreements in these incoming pathways as well. So that's really encouraging that that there's a forward market, so to speak, in these new technologies. So we're very happy about that. On the next page, we have an illustration of another big problem. So not only do we need to have all of this sustainable aviation fuel produced, we also need to be able to access it in a way that is actually not the physical access. I didn't express that very well, I think, but if we can have an airline in Africa, for instance, with no access to physical sustainable aviation fuel, but this airline should still be able to book and claim purchases of sustainable aviation fuel, even if this unfortunate airline lacks access to the actual fuel. And this makes sense because obviously the atmosphere doesn't care where this sustainable aviation fuel is being produced. And we, of course, want to offer all airlines the possibility to meet their decarbonization obligations, even if they are unfortunately located in a place where that proves difficult in the near term. So this is sort of the chart that you see on the right-hand side, that we can separate the actual physical flow of the fuel from the purchasing and generating of credits against our decarbonization obligations. So the challenges, there are many challenges, of course, and but there are also opportunities. So this was also alluded to earlier, that for us, we think that this is an opportunity to, in the very long term, actually reduce our fuel costs. Yeah, in the future, we totally believe that we will be able to buy sustainable aviation fuel at a lower price. So for us, it's also probably at some point a positive, but of course, in terms of financial results, yeah, in the near term it's costly. In the long term, we believe in those potential windfalls. And in terms of economic development, again, this is obviously again an opportunity, yeah, where an opportunity for countries to perhaps take better control of their energy supplies and increase their energy security, whilst improving the environment and creating jobs and helping communities. So we would definitely want to emphasize the opportunity side of this story, even if it is very challenging. And on the next page, we do have a number of challenges, of course, most of those challenges, I would argue, are linked to the fact that we're such a global industry, and every national or regional unilateral initiative, it represents an increased fragmentation for our industry, increased costs, not as good services, etc., etc. So this is, of course, a really challenging nexus right now to try to get the regulators and everybody to help us create these in totally new markets, and at the same time harmonize and standardize to adopt sort of common rules across the globe. And this is of course incredibly challenging, and we have to do so in the space of 28 years, which is of course at breakneck speed, and this clearly requires an exceptional degree of collaboration, which we know is always difficult at the best of times, and perhaps even more so now. So the two enablers that we see are obviously policy and finance. So the policy actions that are needed now are mostly front-loaded, yeah, because we need to create all of these new markets for all of these new technologies, and then the finance assistance we also need from the public sources mostly now, and then the public sources can sort of pull out of the equation, and as the solutions become commercially viable, and public and private money can step in. And I think maybe it's worth just saying something about the money. Yeah, so we have like the top end estimate of how much this is going to cost is $5 trillion over the coming 28 years. And if we divide that by the number of years, we get $180 billion per year in the top level estimate of annual investment needs. And $180 billion a year is a third of the money that in any case goes into new oil and gas exploration. So, you know, already there, I think this is imminently feasible. And then the states who have all promised to stop subsidizing fossil fuel production, they still do so at an annual average pace of $56 billion. So that's a third of our funding needs, potential investment needs, already from that source if we were able to attract it to us. And around 180 billion is also the amount of money that goes in annually into solar and wind. So, you know, this looks imminently feasible. We just need everybody to commit to actually doing this, which, if I go back to the early part of my presentation, it's certainly my impression that everybody has already agreed. So this should actually work. And the last word I want to say in this context is that the motivating factor for all of us in this context, no matter what the transportation mode, is that we can maybe you know, pull off this energy transition, and then we would have a world economy in the future that, you know, freed of its energy constraint, right, where energy is sustainable, cheap, abundant, and accessible to all. And then by definition, you know, transportation, all forms of transportation would benefit from the same energy that is sustainable, cheap, abundant, and accessible to all. And God knows what kind of economic outcomes we would unleash if we were able to pull this off. So I think it is possible, and we need to get started. And the prize money, so to speak, that hangs ahead of us is, you know, infinitely greater than any near-term challenges and costs involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Owens. Fantastic. I think the presentation is really great. And then so now we have 3 distinguished speakers from 3 distinct transport modes. You know, made 3 very different, I think, presentations. I think but they also point to some common issues. For example, the need for global collaboration on decarbonization. And also we also need enabling policies. Okay. Before I open the floor, may I now turn to our 2 discussants to share their views from the policy perspective. First, I would like to invite Jan from UNCTAD. I think we all know him very well. And let us learn from you, Jan, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Rosi, and thanks, congrats to the WTO membership for this meeting, this initiative. I also think we can clearly appreciate the colleagues here from ICS, IRU, IATA. We often find the associations, you are proactively also driving your membership in the right direction. You are membership driven to some extent, but you are also, from your function, a bit more forward looking and trying to see where the world is going and bringing your membership in the right direction. So thanks and congrats on this. I have 3 thoughts where we look at these different modes of transport and trying to think how to compare them, how to put this together. And if I say now some things about one or the other mode, I hope we will still remain friends with the other modes. But to the extent that there is a choice and there is an option for a member state or a regional or an international organization to promote one mode or the other, please promote maritime. Maritime is by far the most energy efficient mode. In this context, I'm just saying in this context here of the decarbonization issue. Yes, we know we still need a truck to get it from the port or from the airport. It's clear there are many things where you do not have substitutes, but here in WTO you have GATS, you have negotiation on trade and maritime transport services, and I think there could be an option. Dreaming is free of charge, to also look at cabotage, for example. No? So if maritime cabotage could be a bit more liberalized, you might move for some countries. I've worked on this, for example, in South America. There are countries with long coastlines, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, where there is potential to move some cargo by ship rather than truck, and maybe ideally even the truck on the ship. We can have a roll-on, roll-off services. The trucker doesn't need to drive and emit himself or herself, but sit on the ship. So that's one point I wanted to make in terms of putting these three together. If there's an option, and if we look at different policy measures that might make maritime slower or more expensive, if this were to lead to more cargo going by air or road, it's something which we would want to avoid. But of course, we see and happily see that air and road are also decarbonizing. So that was one thing, and I hope Jens and I will still remain friends, and Marie, we are good. The second, a bit like in this context of WTO and regulation, of course, there are different ways to regulate. And again, Jens very rightly gave examples of national regulation where ideally you would allow the trucks to cross borders and the more efficient trucks to cross borders, and that benefits from bilateral collaboration. So road, as you said, has a lot of shorter distances, domestic transport, very different potential for international regulation. Air transport, yes, has potential for international regulation, but also more for bilateral, because it's mostly from point to point. And there you can have, and you have, bilateral agreements. Also air transport, a lot of the cargo is actually going in the belly of passenger planes, which is not the case in maritime and not in trucking, very rarely. No, and in maritime, we have the difficulty of having to agree multilaterally, but it's also a huge opportunity. As Simon knows, I'm a big enthusiast, and I used to work for the IMO many years ago. So there's really an opportunity for a multilateral agreement in maritime. And yeah, the third and last point I would like to highlight there, I hope all three would agree from the industry perspective, whether it be it a national, regional, or multilateral agreement, advancement and regulation and levy or tax or fuel standards, the industry needs certainty. And we at UNCTAD, we have done several impact assessments. We do our annual maritime report. We are absolutely confident that what Simon also showed, the volatility, the normal changes, are bigger than the potential change of transport cost increase to decarbonization. Now, member states in Geneva, in London, are of course concerned about increases in transport costs for their trade competitiveness. But the delay in agreeing on something is more costly than the transition itself. That's something we have very recently, again, reviewed different proposals made at the IMO. Won't go into the economics here, but it's very clear that there should be a strong motivation for the regulators, again, national, regional, multilateral, to advance with this agenda. Yes, it will have cost implications, but the costs of delay and inaction would be higher than the costs of the action itself. I hope, yeah, that concludes my 3 thoughts on the 3 modes of transport, and we love all 3 of them.
Thank you, Jan. You never disappoint us. Yeah, so I think now I turn to our second discussant. Antonia, you have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosie, and thanks to all the speakers. It was fascinating. I will actually only focus on air transport. So I'm even more biased in that regard, maybe. And maybe let me start off by thanking Marie, first of all, for a very rich and very clear and also very informative presentation. I think it has outlined very lucidly the tremendous challenges that the air transport sector focuses in order to decarbonize, as well as the scale of those challenges. At the same time, I also think, however, that he has offered some hope that there is a path, there is a strategy to move the industry towards net zero. And so I thought in the next few minutes, maybe I'll take a step back, if you will, and focus more on why air transport services achieving and the air transport sector achieving its decarbonization objectives is crucial, not only, of course, to combat climate change, but also for trade. And I thought I'd do so by considering what role air transport plays in international trade. And I will approach this from 3 angles. First, let me start with air freight transportation. And I think here it's clear to everyone that air transport is important for trading goods. Although, of course, air transport accounts only for a very limited share of the volume of trade, when we measure it in terms of value, it accounts for over 1/3. So it is important. Of course, compared to other modes of transport, air offers several advantages. It is faster. It has the ability to handle some oversized cargo, to connect remotely located airports, and offers, for instance, the opportunity to do cargo maintenance while at the airports. However, of course, air freight transport is much more expensive than sea freight, which is why it is essentially used to transport perishable, high value, or particularly urgent goods. So it is very important for trade in those particular products. Second angle I wanted to take was to look instead at air passenger transport, which is crucial for both trading services and maybe less immediately obvious also to trading goods. So if I start with trading services, air transport is essential to ensure the physical proximity that a lot of services trade relies on. So for instance, it enables the movement of individuals who supply their services by being temporarily present abroad. This is what we call mode 4 under the WTO's GATT services agreements, but it also enables the movement of consumers across borders. And this is mode 2, for example, for the consumption of education or health services, as well as tourism, obviously. However, the connectivity of air transport also provides benefits for services that are traded through other modes of supply. Although with the pandemic, we've seen the value and the importance of being able to trade a lot of services remotely cross-border with digital technologies, it remains essential to connect face-to-face, to have physical interactions in person, particularly for services such as professional services that are maybe more skill-intensive, that exhibit information asymmetries, and that are more customized. And so it is important to ensure that the physical face-to-face interaction is, the possibility of having that physical face-to-face interaction is retained. But then, of course, connectivity that is enabled by air transport is also essential for trade that takes place through the establishment of a commercial presence, what we call mode 3, because business travel enables the establishment of new commercial relationships, of the interaction with customers in order to set up new investment or to manage existing operations across borders. And again, although with digital technologies, we have seen how we've been able to continue functioning as a society, as an economy throughout the pandemic. Now that international travel is restarting, we also see how important a lot of in-person interaction is. And then, as I said, passenger transport is actually also important for trading goods. maybe less obviously so, but first of all, for the same reasons that I highlighted with regard to trade in services, which is that it facilitates in-person interaction, the creation of business contacts, networks, and essentially reducing the distance between buyers and sellers. But also because, as Jan alluded to as well, about half of air freight cargo travels in the belly of passenger airplanes. And so we've seen that and how important that was, in particular during the pandemic, when the grounding of many passenger planes reduced drastically the capacity for air freight and therefore made goods trade slower, more expensive, and more uncertain. And then maybe to take the third aspect and the third point as to why air transport plays an important role in international trade is because actually it is most of air transport is trade in its own right. All international air transport, as well as any domestic transport, cabotage that Jan was referring to earlier, that is operated by foreign-owned transport suppliers, is actually international trade. So more international air transport of this kind is more trade. So this is all to say that essentially trade and air transport and a lot of other modes of transport go hand in hand. And as Marie's presentation has highlighted, the path for air transport to free itself from the energy constraints and to shift to an environmentally sustainable model is far from easy, and it's not going to be cheap. Marie mentioned $5 trillion. It's the cost of the transition. So this shift to decarbonization is also going to increase the cost of trade. And as the aviation industry transitions to a new, if you want, greener, steady state. So trade is part of the solution to climate change, but it is also clear that solving the environmental challenge is essential for trade to continue and to prosper and be a force for economic development and growth. So we have, in a sense, many reasons why we should cheer for all these industry efforts and hope that they will succeed towards a decarbonized, greener future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonia. Now, I'd like to open the floor for questions. I already see Pierre. Before I give you the floor, first, I want to read one question. We got it from online. I think probably that's to Simon. And how would the 30% exactly be used to support the developing countries? I think it's about the fund. Okay. And traditional development work or direct funding of alternative fuels. Okay. And then this is one question we got online. And now, Pierre, you can raise your question.
A series of naive questions for all three modes of transport representative. One question on technology, one on financing and infrastructure, and one on liberalization in general and liberalization and WTO. As far as technology is concerned, that is for maritime, I've heard, I don't know if that's true, or I've read somewhere that there was no magic wand for maritime, and that the new ships that are ordered presently, for instance, by liner shipping company, would have to be smaller, slower, and that they haven't found yet the right fuel, hesitating between methanol and ammonia and so on and so forth. So I'd be curious of the technical feasibility from that angle. I have no question on financing, because the money that at least liner shipping company made over the last 2 years helped probably them financing the transition. But then I have this question for road transport. In the case of road transport, what I've read or heard was that electric, and I'm not only talking about say EU, US, and Japan, so, yeah, developed world. What I've heard is that electric truck were costing twice the price, and that hydrogen trucks were which will be used for long haul, cost thrice the price, and that the infrastructure was not simply there in or will not be there in the time framework similar to that of car, that is to say 2035. And in the case of road transport, these are very different from shipping, at least from liner shipping. These are a very small company in general, except in Holland and except in the US. And they just can't afford that. So the logical consequences of decarbonization should be a tripling of the cost. So is that true, or am I just spoiling the feast? Then I come to liberalization, and there I have a question for the three of you. I notice that Jan said we have to go cross-border, and he also mentioned transit without mentioning transit quota and the fact that transit quota were totally illegal in terms of GATT ever since 1947. It's not only the TFA, but Article 5 of the GATT that makes it illegal. Nevertheless, everybody applies them, and they are really a break to direct link. And so are bilateral agreements that still apply outside EU to go inside EU member states. So there I have a macroeconomic question for transport, which is, would a liberalization of this flux shorten the trip and therefore create emission reduction? Or would the impact of this liberalization create additional demand for transport, because the two effects have to be balanced, and that goes for both transit quota and for bilateral quota and for cabotage. Coming to cabotage, of course, I read, of course, long ago, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, what Jan wrote about Latin America, and it's the same for inline forwarding in China and so on and so forth. So. But as we all know, cabotage in WTO will never, ever be discussed because of one big member that has a very specific legislation on that. And then I turn to aviation. We know also that in aviation, cabotage will never, ever be discussed, but would a liberalization of air transport translate in less emission? I doubt it, because in fact, liberalization in terms of aviation only means additional capacity, and therefore additional capacity means more plane, and therefore more emission, at least until we get sustainable aviation fuel. So that's basically my naive questions.
Okay, I think we have more questions online, but I'd like to give floor to speakers to first answer this question. Okay, I'll try.
Firstly, with the question online about money for developing countries. So if we have an IMO fund and a third of the money goes to developing countries, the details of that would actually be decided by IMO member states. But we anticipate that that money would be for specific projects under a big strategic plan, focusing particularly on bunkering infrastructure in ports and facilities to provide alternative fuels in ports. But that's a little way down the track. We have to actually have the mechanism in place and the money to spend, and then we can start thinking about how we spend it. Very quickly on the question from Pierre, and also picking up Jens' points, actually, although I placed huge emphasis on the fuels, that's not to dismiss the importance of the technical and operational measures that we can take. But generalization is always difficult, but there comes a point through technical and operational measures. Some people argue you can perhaps achieve a 70% reduction in GHG intensity, but ultimately the only way you're going to get to zero is with the switch to the new fuels. And in shipping in particular, I can't emphasize enough that fuel by far is the most important cost. So for us, it's purely enlightened self-interest to do everything possible to minimize our fuel consumption. But we need both. But ultimately, if we're serious about net zero, and it's governments that are telling us we're going to get to net zero, you're the government representatives, and the shipping industry takes that message seriously. And because we're told that, constantly told we're not doing enough, and actually we believe net zero is possible, but only through collaboration with governments and we're not asking for any money either. Be clear, all we want to do is have a mechanism that ensures a level playing field so that the shipping industry can have a cooperative mechanism that we can allow the first movers to take the burden in the interests of the collective so that we all get to net zero. But that was turning into a speech rather than answering a question. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor. On the infrastructure and the vehicle, I think it's a very important question because neither of them is there. Neither the infrastructure is there, nor the vehicles for long distance freight transport are there in huge numbers. There are some exercise with Tesla trucks or whatever. They say like, we have it, but are they available to the market? No, they're not. And that's the big problem that we have with that. It's not to say like fuels are not important. They are important in the long term, but at the moment we can scale up other measures quicker. And that was my key message. On the costs, Pierre, you said 2 times higher. It's actually 3 times higher, the cost of buying a battery electric vehicles these days, not looking at the operating costs. Some of our members say like, the vehicle manufacturers, they say like, we would pay you the 2 times extra. And over the time, you repay us as operator the extra money. So they trying to incentivize already the buying of battery electric vehicles. And we have 2 operators who said, we want to do that. Give us 2,000 trucks. And the vehicle manufacturers are like, 2020 maybe, or 24, you can have those vehicles, but not now, not possible. So we're selling a wish at the moment. They're selling a wish. It's not realistic. And again, what we're saying, like scale up what's there quicker. We can't wait to decarbonize, scale up quicker and invest and look into the costs and the availability of infrastructure and vehicles in the longer run. Liberalization, good point, very good point. And my head was spinning to say, like, how do I answer that in a proper way? And I think the good answer on liberalization is, and that is our take on it, there has to be a step-by-step market opening. You don't do a big splash, because then it would create a distortion and a lot of extra transport. But if you have a market opening which goes slowly, lifts the social working conditions in the countries, social conditions are equal, you let go of the permits bit by bit, then if you have like a fair competition between markets, you don't have more transport. Then you have the same situation as you have now in the EU, you have the best transport available. Big opening, no. Then you have more transport, step-by-step market opening, liberalization with making sure that there's a fair competition, then you won't have more transport.
Thank you, Jens. Before I give the floor to Marie, here's another additional question for you online. So you can combine all these questions together in your answer. What are the prospects of achieving affordable, sustainable aviation fuels, and what would be the timeline? Okay, the floor is yours, Marie.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with that one. So we think that you know, the ramp up needs to happen between now and 2030, 2035, and that somewhere closer to 2040 or past 2040, the price of those new sustainable aviation fuels should start falling, and we hope, of course, fall below the price of jet fuel. You know, this is obviously very hypothetical, but that is nevertheless the way that we would expect things to happen. And on all the other comments that have been made, so first of all, we of course want to be friends with everybody, so we're totally friends with UNCTAD, no problem. And I hope that showed in our presentation that what we actually wish to promote in the interest of a sustainable, prosperous and inclusive global economy is all modes of transportation and making them sustainable, cheaper, accessible, and better in every way for everybody. And then, you know, in a very European liberal economy tradition, liberal in the best positive sense of that word, we think that the best economic outcomes come by proposing all of those multiple alternatives to people, yeah, and everybody competing with each other brings the price down, increases the quality of the service, and then consumers can optimize. I do not understand why there is now a hankering for these, what I would, brutally call status policies, and why somehow, we now think that the state should choose who should go by what means of transport on what distance. Yeah, that just clearly doesn't rhyme in my understanding of the 4 freedoms in Europe, for instance, and it, it's clearly against the freedoms that we can trace all the way back to the oracles of Delphi. So our whole civilization is based upon this, and we know the tremendous prosperity that has come from these freedoms, whatever shape they have taken over the years. And anybody who's lived through COVID, should be blatantly aware of how nasty that experience was. So what we want to do is obviously promote all of these modes of transportation, and the governments should enable and protect. Yeah, that's what we want to do. So we want more economic activity. We want these economic activities to be sustainable. This is how we can live up to the sustainable development goals and have this prosperous and inclusive economy that also respects the planet upon which we all depend. So in that vein, liberalization for us is obviously, again, that we can promote in our domain, the aviation, the global environment in which to operate, right? So airspace, I don't know to what extent you are aware, but airspace is scarce, right? And we have to pay for traversing people's airspace, different rates over different countries. And of course, now with war in Europe, airspace has become even more scarce. Everybody's military activities have increased, and there's just less space to fly around. And in Europe, it is really quite insane, yeah, that we have all these barriers between our airspace in Europe. And let's pick on Switzerland. Yeah, why do we have 2 systems in Switzerland? This could obviously be cut, and one system would do, and we would cut those costs in half. So obviously, it is the consumers of those services who are paying the price of all of those not particularly efficient proceedings, and ultimately the passengers, because it congests the airspace and makes it so much more difficult to produce, to take people from A to B, which is what we do. And one final word, I know that I'm also going on forever, I do apologize, but the level playing field could not be more important for our industry, obviously. And a final word in that context on taxes, yeah, that when our industry is taxed differently at different rates, it obviously skews this whole global service notion. And let me just say that we are expecting our industry to produce a net profit margin of 1.2% this year, yeah, 1.2%. That is $2.20 per passengers, yeah. So maybe we'll start asking for tips as you board the plane next time, yeah. And 1/3 of the ticket price is taxes. So we're absolutely happy investing and paying for anything green that actually benefits our sustainability, quest, but a lot less happy being taxed just for general taxation purposes. And this in particular, when the oil and gas industry is realizing profits much closer to 30%. So there's definitely something wrong with that picture. Thank you for letting me say all that.
Thank you, Marie. I think we have some more questions, but we only have 5 minutes. And here's another question I think is for Jens. I think with the question is, with respect to road transport by rules, the TFA is excellent regulation. However, practically there is a domestic political strategy that aims at protecting domestic goods and local transportation for employment by making transit difficult, delayed, long waiting time, and other reasons. In this case, how do we find the solution going for green trade? Okay.
A very good question. In fact, I could have asked that question to WTO, because that is really, you should answer that one. We absolutely behind that. What the colleague on online requested. There has to be a political will. There has to be global coordination in this respect, and we cannot accept political fortresses not in favor of trade and transport, and because that will ultimately undermine the work on decarbonization in our industry. So I think this is really something, a message, like a nice outcome message of the conference, to say, like, we need global coordination, we need the WTO to work on this.
Well, I don't know whether we have enough time to address. We have another 4 more questions here. I think this is for shipping again. In relation to the fuel levy proposed by IMO, how is it envisaged that responsibilities for payment of this will be apportioned between ship owners and the charters? And we've seen a lot of criticism on this front in relation to C22, the CII, and in particular the BIMCO clause. Okay, so that's for Simon, obviously.
I think we have a maritime specialist.
Yeah,
I think we have a maritime specialist online there. The simple answer is that the important thing to understand is that with the proposal that IMO is considering, governments would not be responsible for collecting the money. It would be a revenue raising system that would be administered by the IMO, but no money would pass to governments. Then actually the issue of who ultimately pays, of course, when it comes to any environmental measure, the simple answer is we all pay. So shipping companies have to bear the costs, but then of course they get passed down the value chain to their customers. And actually, I don't want to go into the complexities of our new carbon intensity framework that IMO has adopted for us, but it's proved very controversial, simply because it's been very difficult to negotiate commercially who is ultimately responsible for the cost. But with our fuel levy, we think it's relatively simple, because essentially the party that is responsible for the cost of the fuel is the party that would pay the cost of the levy. But that's a shipping industry problem rather than a governmental problem.
Okay, I think if you can bear with me, if you can bear, yeah, I will pick up your question. I think because this some other questions are very interesting. At this, I think it's for everyone here, how a country can open up its market when it cannot afford imports. Like going through a severe balance of payment issues, setting up an environmentally friendly economy is very expensive. So I think it's for everyone. And then another question I think is also for everyone. Please speak more on the best ways to convert fossil fuel subsidies to sustainable subsidies. Will there be disruptive effects on transport? And then another question, this is from our friend, Çiğdem from Turkey. She is expert on road transport. I think this is a question to Jens. Liberalization adds value to decarbonization when it is taken step by step, of course, but it is also valid for transit quotas. That's her comment. Because in terms of transit, there's no competition problem as the service is not supplied to the country on transit route. Would you please share your views on liberalization of transit quotas and its efficiency effect on environment? Okay. And then we have the last question from the back of the room, please.
Does this work? Yes. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Vishwa Subramaniam from the Development Division of the WTO. And my question is more focused to Mr. Hugel on road transportation in particular. And I do agree that the supply side capacity, the infrastructure capacity has proven to be an issue, but there are some baby steps along the way. And one that I look at is the secondary market for vehicles, more automobiles. And it is burgeoning, especially in the developing world. You look at Africa, you look at Asia, as the middle income increases, there's more consumption of light automobile vehicles, but also heavy for cross-border transportation and so on. So I just wanted to get your take on what the IRU has done on this and what your take would be in general.
Okay, now I turn to our each speaker, including our discussant, if you want to cover the questions and also make some final comments. Maybe I still start with Simon.
Oh, I've spoken too much, so I defer to other sectors, please.
Okay, maybe I should start with Marie, please.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I feel I've spoken a lot too, but I will nevertheless take the opportunity to say that these fuel subsidies that governments give in favor of fossil fuel production, are just handouts to a sector that's already making 30% margins. Yes, so I don't think that would disrupt anybody to stop those. Of course, it's a completely different issue when we're talking about consumption subsidies for fossil fuel consumption, because that's akin to social programs, and that would need to be done differently than just a brutal halt. And in a similar vein, the countries that face potential balance of payments crises and so on, and how expensive it is for them to develop renewable energy strategies, I do of course sympathize, but this should be part of a national economic development strategy. And again, I think that the dividends down the number of years for adopting these strategies are great. And of course, again, the states have promised, to put up money in various ways at the various COPs and so on, and of course these monies have not yet been dispersed fully. So we definitely have to take on board the regional imbalances and make sure that we address those collectively in the world. That's for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens.
First, on the fuel subsidies and fuel costs, we are not in favor of any subsidy. We want an equal treatment of all modes, and we want to compete with all modes. So that's quite straightforward. But let's put it a slightly different story on what this is. This is about the ultimate fuel costs. A lot of people say, like, well, electricity might be cheaper in the future than fossil fuel. Bear with us on this one, because governments cash in on fuel taxes. If fossil fuel taxes will be disappearing at one point, guess what they're going to do? They're going to tax electricity. They're going to tax electricity for electric vehicles. And that's where the money comes from. So in the end, there will be, again, a fuel cost increase, be it on fossil fuel or be it on non-fossil fuel. So that, I think, is really a fiscal reality. On the secondary market, that's a very interesting question, because one thing that we say is, if you produce a lot of battery electric vehicles in Europe, second-hand market is normally CIS countries, Middle East, North Africa. There, you can't use them. You just can't use those vehicles. So what are you going to do with them? We, as IRU, would just warn the vehicle manufacturers and the European politicians, for example, to just bet on one initiative on battery electric vehicles. Also keeping in mind the consequence on the second-hand market and where these vehicles then ultimately go. On the transit quota and environment, I have to say here I don't have the figures to what extent there is an impact of the liberalization of transit quotas on environmental performance. I have to say I don't have that figure. Whereas I can say that transit countries do have an economic benefit of those vehicles transiting. They go to the drivers go to hotels, they go to restaurants there. So there is an economic benefit for transiting countries too. Having said that, I don't know by heart facts and figures on the environmental impact of a liberalized transit quota.
Okay, no, thanks for this last opportunity. And I appreciate the answers of the panelists and agree also what Marie said about the liberal approach. Three quick thoughts on some of the questions. There was this question about the 30% for developing countries that Simon mentioned, and that's, of course, as we know, it is just to get the ball rolling, and I really appreciate the ICS is developing and proposing mechanisms, ideas, and the final coefficient percentage is to be decided by the IMO members. But from UNCTAD's perspective, I think we can confidently say that there are good reasons why funds have to go to the small island developing states or the least developed countries. They're not the ones that cause the current level of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. They are already paying higher transport costs empirically. We can measure this. And we have measured this. They will see a higher increase in transport costs with any of the proposed measures. So, and they need to vote in favor. So it's a bit of politics here, of course, that they need to see that if transport costs go up through those decarbonization measures, we need to help them reduce the transport cost through port modernization, customs modernization, climate resilient, climate adaptation. I mean, there are many things where they can be helped so that in other ways they reduce their transport costs. That's the reasoning behind why I would assume and think it could and should be more than 30%, but that's not Simon or I to decide, I guess. Very quickly on Pierre's question about the transit quota and so on, the reference to the TFA, one has to distinguish between the freedom of transit under Article 5 of GATT and Article 11 of the TFA, which is really about the goods. But the quotas are mostly on the transport modes. And it is, of course, in reality, you need the transport to move the goods. So it does affect. But yeah, there were a lot of discussions during the negotiations of the TFA on exactly this topic. And the last, not least point, your eloquent description of the Jones Act. Did you say Jones Act? I'm particularly unhappy about the Jones Act because other countries use it as an example why they also like to shoot themselves in their own foot. Thank you.
Okay, Simon, you want to say the last word? Or you?
Pragmatism.
Okay.
And realism.
And realism. That's three.
Okay. Okay, we have already run out of time, and I think we have a great session, really interesting, and presentations and also follow-up questions and answers. Decarbonization has raised a lot of compelling issues to which we don't have answer to them. One thing is certain, that we are all compelled to think, to debate, and to work together to find solutions. I think today we all have learned a lot, and I want to thank you again for your great presentations and your great thoughts. And with this, I conclude the session. Thank you very much for coming, for your attention, for all the participants online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.